Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support of this really special place. I'm honored tonight to introduce our speaker. When I'm asked to introduce speakers, always know you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear her, so let me make this brief. I'll just say this. Doris Kearns Goodwin is at the height of her profession, and that profession, I believe, is among our most important. Knowing our history and learning from it is always vital, but I would say it's most essential in a republic like ours. As President Lincoln said, this is the government of, by, and for the people. And it's imperative that the people know history and heed its lessons. Doris, through so many amazing works, has shown us that history like no one else. We've recognized her here before. In the library, you may have seen her portrait from the year she was the 9th Annual Lincoln Leadership Prize awardee, and she serves as a life member of our Foundation's Board of Directors. I'm so pleased she could join us here this evening as we celebrate another wonderful and very relevant book, Leadership in Turbulent Times. Doris, from a real fan, thank you for what you do. Thank you for your support of this library museum, and please join me in welcoming Doris Kearns Goodwin.
All right, the mics are on.
Mics are on.
Great. Well, welcome, Doris.
I'm so glad to be back here. It feels like being back home. This place means so much to me, and thank you all for being here. It's great.
Welcome back to Springfield. Now, as Alan mentioned, you've been back before for several different occasions. Have any of, I mean, I'm sure they all stand out for you, but have there been any special ones, any stories you want to tell about any of your visits here?
Well, clearly, the first visit, when I was still a rookie, not even done with even thinking about what I was going to write about, meant so much because the people here were so helpful, and I began to think that maybe there would be a book on Abraham Lincoln. It was pretty scary at the beginning, knowing that 14,000 books had already been written about him. So luckily, I came upon the idea of writing about his team of rivals rather than a biography on him, for which so much had been done. But probably the most fun time of being here was after Steven Spielberg decided that he was going to make the movie Lincoln, based in part on my book. He had always wanted Daniel Day-Lewis to be his Lincoln, but there were two scripts while I was still finishing the books that was finished before I finished, and they didn't get Daniel Day-Lewis to say yes. He said he loved them and they were very deep, but they weren't right for him. So finally, the day that Daniel said, yes, I will be Lincoln, to Tony Kushner's script, Stephen called me up. He said, you've got to bring him to Springfield right away. He wants to see everything, but he wants to come under an assumed name because he wants to be an entire year in preparation for becoming Mr. Lincoln. So he flew us together. We came here, and we were supposed to eat in the hotel and under an assumed name. And I said to him, so we're just eating here? And he said, oh, no, let's go to a bar. So we went to a bar. And immediately, I'd already told all the people the next day on the tour, pretend you don't know who he is, everything will be fine. But immediately after we were there for a few minutes, somebody bought us drinks. I thought, oh my God, it's already over. But they didn't recognize him. It was me they recognized. So it was a big part of the joke between us. So anyway, we had a great night together. We became friends. And for an entire year, I would send him books on Henry Clay and Webster. We would text each other. My kids teased me that I learned to text so I could text with Daniel Day-Lewis since he didn't email. And so I went to the filming in Richmond, Virginia, but I couldn't see him. No one could see him who went on the days that he was filming. He was never out of character. Even the other actors had to call him Mr. Lincoln or Mr. President. So I never got to see my friend Daniel Day until the premiere in LA and then New York. So when we went to New York, he said, okay, you've got to come to my favorite bar, his, the Carlisle, and we'll remember that first bar night in Springfield. So we went, and I had these concoctions that he loved, old Cubans. It was fine. He had more than I did, which will become relevant. But anyway, everything was great. And then he wins the first of a series of awards in New York, and Stephen comes to give it to him, the New York Circle Critics Award, and tells the story of how many times he'd wanted to have him as his Lincoln, and he wrote beautiful letters of rejection, but he didn't say yes until finally he did. So Daniel got up there and he said, I don't reject everything. When Doris Kearns Goodwin asked me to go binge drinking with her, I accept it at once. And then there was a Wall Street Journal reporter in the room, so it was in the paper the next day. I was honored to go binge drinking, but I'll never forget that first night with Daniel, staying in the hotel, going across to the bar, becoming friends with this man who so embodied Lincoln that I thought he was there. I thought it was him. We saw the first cut of a movie I did in Stephen's house in California with his wife seeing it for the first time and his executive assistant, and he was so nervous. This is the mark of a true professional, Stephen was, that he was outside pacing, and he came in and he said, well, what did you think? And we said, we didn't even think it was a movie. We just saw Mr. Lincoln alive. So he called Daniel in Ireland. He said, they liked it, and we broke out the champagne. So the whole movie making thing was such a wonderful thing. I got to live with Mr. Lincoln for yet another 5 years. So he's now occupied about almost 20 years of my life. So you can imagine why I'm so happy to be with all of you tonight.
Thank you, Joe. So the title of your book is Leadership in Turbulent Times, and you speak of turbulent times during the presidencies of Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and LBJ. But you call them your guys. Why are they your guys?
I guess when you spend so much time with them, I waked up with them in the morning, I thought about them when I went to bed at night. I really felt like I knew them. My only fear always was that, having spent my life as a presidential historian looking at presidents who are no longer alive, it may seem an odd profession to spend so much time with dead presidents, but I wouldn't have changed it for anything in the world. My only fear is that in the afterlife there'll be a panel of all the presidents that I've ever studied, and every single one will tell me every single thing I got wrong about them, and the first person to scream out will be Lyndon Johnson. How come those damn books on the Roosevelts were twice as long as the book you wrote about me?
So, the book is Turbulent Times. Are we in the worst of times?
So many people will come up to me and say that. Are these the worst of times? Hoping that because I'm an historian, I'll have some answer to that. And I think the answer history provides is no, we have lived in far worse times. And it's important to remember that, because we got through those times. I mean, think of what it was like for Abraham Lincoln when he took the presidency. The country already split into a war that would kill more than 600,000 people about to begin. He later said if he'd ever imagined the anxiety he would feel during those first months, he wasn't sure he could have lived through it. Or think of Teddy Roosevelt coming into the presidency with the assassination of McKinley, when the country was really shaken by the Industrial Revolution, much as it has been today by the tech revolution and the global revolution. He said, and he knew at the time that, excuse me, that the two classes were really split apart. The working class people felt cut off from the capitalists now that they had these huge corporations. The people, lots of immigrants were coming in from abroad. People in the rural areas felt cut off from people in the cities. And there was a real talk of a coming revolution. There were lots of strikes, lots of bombing. It was a difficult time when he came in. Or imagine what it was like for FDR coming in when the banks were collapsing. People couldn't get their savings out of the banks, their deposits. No jobs were to be held, wages were down, hunger was in the streets, and there was a worry that capitalism might itself be at risk. Or even Lyndon Johnson coming in with JFK's assassination and not being certain whether there was a conspiracy from Cuba or the mafia or Russia, and more importantly, that the civil rights movement was heating up. There were bombings of little kids in the civil rights movement. The bill was stuck to desegregate this House in the Senate and the Congress, no thought that it could come out. And there was a sense that the racial divisions were harder than ever before. And yet, in all those times, we came through. So I think it's important for us. We live in a time now that really does feel very turbulent, an unmoored time, unprecedented time. And it's important to remember that the people living then didn't know how it would end either. Because now that we know it ended all right, in terms of the America still getting stronger and the common mission being developed, we can feel a certain placid nation looking back on it. But they didn't know, just as we don't know. So I'd like to believe that this perspective and reassurance that history provides us, this country has been through really difficult things before, somehow this country keeps coming through. I believe it will. That's my optimism. That's what has to keep us going. Pessimism will get us nowhere. It's just that we have to become active to make sure that happens, and we can talk about that as we go along.
We have some water, too. So how did you decide to write this book, and why now?
I think partly I decided because after I finish each one of these presidents, I then take a new one into my life, and I always feel like a little guilty leaving the old one behind, because I have to move all of his books away and the new guy comes in. So I thought, after I finished Teddy and Taft, what if instead of taking a new president, I just lived with the guys I cared with the most once again? I didn't want to leave them, but look at them in a new way through the lens of leadership. When I was in graduate school, we used to stay up at night. It may sound rather nerdy, but we would ask these big questions as we were reading Plato or Aristotle. You know, is leadership born, inborn, or is it made? Where does ambition come from? Does the man make the times, or the times make the man? These were all the questions I cared about long ago. And I thought, I'd love to look at these guys. I had obviously thought about them as leaders, but it was mixed in with their families, their colleagues, and the historic times. And I wanted to look more personally at when did they first think of themselves as leaders? Where did they get this ambition from? So that was a big decision. And I thought it would be easy because I thought I knew them. And then it turned out to be relatively short project of mine, 5 years, in order to get the new research and think about it in a new way. And it turned out to be a really wonderful adventure. And I'd like to think that as a book on leadership, it's not just about them, but it's about how you lead, how you learn how to lead, that's relevant for people in any field, not just those who may make it to the top of the White House.
Yes, and you have a blurb from Warren Buffett on the back. It is a book for anyone. It's for corporate, it's for everyday life.
I mean, that's what I hope. Leadership is about human nature, and the way you have to lead, you have to build a team, you have to build purpose in that team, you have to have certain human qualities that we'll talk about, of humility and empathy and capacity to speak and talk in a language that people understand. And all of those things are relevant for all of us, whether we're teachers or lawyers or leaders. So that was what was fun to think about, hopefully, that this could be instructive for other people and that they would learn something from these great characters of ours.
And so you start the book off looking at all four presidents when they were young. And they, did they at that time aspire to be great men, or, what were they thinking at such a young age that brought them to the fore?
Yeah, I decided to start when they ran for office the first time, because I realized I was at a college campus not long ago, and somebody said, how can I ever become one of those leaders? I was talking about the Roosevelts. They are on Mount Rushmore, they're on the currency, they're in movies, we're too far removed from us. So I figured if I started when they ran for office the first time, then they'd struggle, they would fail, and people would be able to see that leadership is not easy and life is not easy. So the only one who, I think at the beginning, had a sense of ambition that went beyond self, which they all started with, was Abraham Lincoln. I mean, that handbill that he writes when he runs for office from New Salem the first time for the state legislature is still remarkable to me. Every man has his peculiar ambition, he began. Mine is to be esteemed of by my fellow man and to be worthy of that esteem. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing that a young person is thinking that way. And then he puts forth what he stands for. You were supposed to do that in those days. You wrote a handbill. But then what I loved is that later he said, I'm not sure that the voters will bring me into this. I don't have any popular relations to recommend me. And I haven't been here very long. So if you don't choose me, I've been too familiar with disappointment to be very much chagrined. But then he says, but it's almost like a warning, but if I fail, I'm going to keep trying. In fact, I think I might try 5 or 6 times until it's too humiliating, and I promise you I won't try again. But right there was that resilience, that willingness to know that he could fail and fail again. And as we saw throughout his career, that stayed with him through the rest of his life. Through the first run in Congress, then he didn't get the chance to run again, through 2 failed Senate races, until, of course, he was a dark horse candidate for the presidency. So that's him. He's at a different level in some ways, because the others, when Teddy Roosevelt runs in 23, same years of age, somebody comes to him and says, why don't you run from the Silk Stocking district? And he says, I didn't go in to help other people at the time. He conceded, I just thought it would be fun, the adventure of politics. And so he runs and he easily wins because the district was all set for him. And it was only later, he said, that he began to realize that politics gave you a chance to do something to help other people. When he went into the tenement houses, when he went through the slums, he began to see that maybe there was something he could do, and then politics became a vocation, whereas at the beginning it was just an adventure. And for FDR, he was relatively a late bloomer. It wasn't until he was 28, and he was not a very good student necessarily at Groton or Columbia Law School or Harvard College. He was working in a Wall Street law firm and a clerk in the law firm when, again, he's approached by the Dutchess County Democratic leader saying he'd like to have him run for a safe Democratic seat, not because he had done anything like to show that he was the making of a leader, but rather because his name was Roosevelt, and they figured that some old guys might think that it's really Teddy Roosevelt instead of him, so he'd get Republicans as well as Democrats. But the interesting thing is he said yes immediately, and once he got out on the trail, this guy who was so gregarious but had lived such an insulated life with his parents realized that he loved it. He loved talking to people. He loved listening to them. Eleanor, who was there at the time, said he wasn't a very good speaker at the beginning, that he would pause between sentences, and they were so fearful that he might never go on, but that by the time he finished campaigning, he was taking so much time up there, they had to drag him off the stage because he loved what he was doing. But he found in politics what everyone hopes to find. What the philosopher William James said is that that voice within that says, this is the real me. And of course, that was the politics was meant for him. LBJ, again, is somewhat of an outlier because I think he loved politics from the time he was 2 years old. His father was in the state legislature. He loved listening to the father and the cronies talk. And he started to think about wanting power from the time he was young. When he got to college, he figured out, well, the way to get power is to get close to the people who have power. So he figured, I have to get close to the president of the college. So the way he did that was he got a job mopping floors outside the president's office so he could talk to the president. So he talked so much that finally the president brings him in from mopping floors into the office. He becomes a clerk. He becomes a messenger. Before you know it, he's running the president's office. And then his whole life, he learned the way to climb the ladder was through mentors. So Sam Rayburn, Richard Russell became his mentor. But the first time he goes to Washington, it's hilarious. He's working as the chief of staff for a congressman who's just been elected, and he realizes he has to learn the ropes of Washington. He's never been there before. So all the congressional secretaries live in the same hotel, the Dodge Hotel. So he figures, I have to figure out who will be the best mentors of all these guys. So he goes into the bathroom in the morning, and he brushes his teeth at 10-minute intervals so he could talk to 4 different groups of people. And then at night, he takes 4 different showers so he can talk to 4 different groups of people. He finally figures out who his mentors are, and they said within 6 months that he was more sophisticated about the ways of Washington than someone who had been there for 25 years. So it was interesting to see how they all started. As I say, the other 3 really went into it more just at the beginning for ambition, for self, and that's not an unusual thing. In fact, it was interesting, but Lincoln had that thing at the start. Every man has his peculiar ambition. I did an exit interview with President Obama a couple of months before he left office, and I started with that phrase of what Lincoln said. And I said, is that the way you thought about it when you first went into politics? And he said, I wish I could say that, but not so. He said, I think when you're young, most people have a more common ambition. In his case, maybe to do something to prove to his absent father that he was something, or maybe to prove in a mixed racial area that he could be somebody, or maybe just to be something important, but not aware until much later that you were hoping to be in politics, something that could do something for other people. So that's the big thing I think you look for in any real leader, is when does that transference take place from ambition for self for ambition for the greater good.
So how does their ambition for greatness differ from the cult of celebrity from today?
Hugely different. No, I think, what they all were thinking about is how would they, interestingly, once they became leaders that were thinking about the greater good, they were thinking about how they'd be remembered after they died. A cult of celebrity is today. It's what happens to you today. It's what your popularity is, how you can walk through the streets and people will remember you right now. But I think not thinking that in the long run you want to stand the test of time. And I think that's very different. I mean, interestingly, even about LBJ, despite that pursuit of power that he really went after most of his life, there was a transforming experience when he was young. When he was at college, he went for a year, he had to make money to become a teacher at a small school, a Mexican-American school in Cotulla, Texas. And he saw there, as he later said, the pain of prejudice on kids' faces, and he wanted to fire ambition in these kids and make them feel that they could do something in their lives. So he became everything in the school. He was the principal, he was the coach, he was the debate coach. He used his athletic money for athletic equipment for the kids, and he changed their lives. I read the oral histories that said he made them feel they had a chance in life. And that even though when he got away from college and he started to pursue power, he sort of lost that larger ambition in just the pursuit of power, until finally he gets to the majority leadership in the Senate, and he's the most powerful majority leader the Senate has ever seen. And 6 months later, he had a massive heart attack. And he came out of that heart attack and he said to himself, well, what if I died now? How would I be remembered? And that's when he started thinking in larger terms. He became the first senator to get a civil rights bill through the Senate. And then, of course, when he gets into the presidency, despite that legacy in Vietnam, always cutting his legacy in two, he was extraordinary on civil rights. And I think that was the transference for him. I think for Teddy Roosevelt, it was after he got into the state legislature, he sort of realized that he had a swelled head. He admitted that he was so happy that he was able to cut down his opponents with blistering language. He would make headlines everywhere he went, and he became a really important figure as just a state legislator in New York. But then after a while, he realized he couldn't get anything done. He had made such enemies on the Democratic side, and even his Republican colleagues thought he was too big for his britches. He did love being in the center of attention, much like our current president, I might say. They said about him that he wanted to be the baby at the baptism, and the bride at the wedding, and the corpse at the funeral. But after he realized he was failing, he said he rose like a rocket, and he fell like a rocket. And then he learned to moderate his histrionic language, and he began to see the extraordinary fulfillment that politics can bring if you can change people's lives. So that's Teddy. I mean, FDR, after a while, I think he realized too that he was pretty arrogant as a young guy, and he got into some scuffles with people, and he learned too that he had to moderate himself. So there's those moments, I think, when they all realize that you have to care about the other people more than just about your own ambition, and then your own ambition will last the test of time.
So how did they handle their personal setbacks?
Yeah, the thing about all of them is that, and I think it's true for many of us in life, I mean, Ernest Hemingway said, everyone is broken by life, but afterwards some people are broken, and some people are stronger in the broken places. They all suffered really harrowing adversities and came through wiser with greater perspective. Of course, as we all know, with Lincoln, he had had adversity from the time he was young, you know, having to scour the countryside for books and read everything he could lay his hands on. His father being tough with him about reading books, thinking that he was not being industrious on the farm. But then most importantly, once he got into politics, he began to feel that maybe he was beginning to have a chance at another life other than cutting rails and splitting rails or shucking corn. And he was working his way up in the state legislature, but he had promised the people in that very first handbill that he would create an infrastructure project. It was called internal improvements, and he'd given them the word that he would build these so that poor farmers could get their stuff to market, and little towns would grow up to bigger towns, and the state would be really a much more thriving state. And then a recession hit the state, and he was the main sponsor of these infrastructure bills, and they never got finished as a result. And the state went into a recession, a debt, people were not coming into Illinois, and he felt he had broken his word to the people. And that led to a beginning of a serious depression. At the same time, he had broken his engagement to Mary Todd, knowing that he had humiliated her, even though he wasn't sure he was ready to be married. And he spiraled into a depression so deep that his friends took all knives and razors and scissors from his room. But the great thing is, and this is so Lincoln, when his great friend Joshua Speed came to his side and said, "Lincoln, you must rally or you will die," he said, "I know that, and I would just as soon die now, but I've not yet accomplished anything to make any human being remember that I have lived." So it was that became his lodestar and carried him through all the rest of his difficulties in life. For Teddy, it was pretty harrowing as well. He was in the state legislature. He had gotten married. His wife was about to give birth to a child. He got a telegram that the child had been born. They celebrated with cigars, and then a second telegram came saying, "You must come home at once. Your wife is dying, and your mother is dying too." His mother was only 49. She had come to take care of his wife. She contracted typhoid fever and was dying. By the time he got home, she died. 12 hours later, his wife died in childbirth. And that cycled him into a depression, but it ended up changing his life too. He ended up leaving the state legislature and going to the Badlands, thinking that maybe if he just put himself on a horse 15 hours a day, it would prevent overthought. But by being there for 2 years, he became a man of the West, not simply a man of the East. And he became a colorful character to people that probably just being an Easterner wouldn't have been. And again, it pushed him away from his own insulated childhood. And when he came back to the East, he no longer had a feeling, I'm just climbing a rung to the presidency. He said, I'm going to take whatever job allows me to feel like I'm doing something. And if it's my last job, because by then he was fatalistic, it won't matter. So he became civil service commissioner, police commissioner, things that people thought were below him. And he loved those jobs, and it made a difference in his life. And then he's assistant secretary of the Navy, but he takes a job instead as a soldier. And people said, you have more power as assistant secretary of the Navy. But he wanted to be a soldier. And of course, that's the moment when he has the Rough Riders and becomes a character that people in the country know. So that by the time he reached the presidency, he'd had a series of winding jobs that would not have probably been possible had not that sadness occurred, sent him to the West, sent him to the Rough Riders. And then, of course, the most searing crucible of all is Franklin Roosevelt's. I mean, he's still in his 30s, he's athletic, he loves swimming, he loves riding horseback, he loves walking in the woods, and he gets stricken with infantile paralysis, and the day later he can no longer walk for the rest of his life on his own power. And so he cycled into a depression for several years, even as he tried to walk again. But amazingly, the efforts he put into that, they said he would need to strengthen his chest and his back muscles to be able to manipulate the wheelchair and get in and out of it. And so he would crawl around on his library floor for hours, just learning to strengthen his back. And then he'd climb the stairs one at a time, hoisting himself on the banisters. And when he got to the top, they'd celebrate. Eleanor said he had a wonderful way of celebrating every small victory that he had. But probably the most amazing thing that changed him was when he went to Warm Springs, the rehabilitation center that he set up for his polio patients. And he knew, he said he became Doc Roosevelt. He was the therapy advisor. He did everything for them. And he felt like he was changing their lives. They played water polo and tag. They had wheelchair dances. At night, they had cocktail parties. And they learned from the oral histories I read there that they could live a life of purpose again. So that just made him much more able to connect to other people to whom fate had dealt an unkind hand once he got into the presidency.
Challenges that they faced as presidents?
Well, you know, I think in some ways what I came to think about was that each person was right for the time. It's not that the set of leadership traits that are universal, even though there's some family resemblance, which I hope we can talk about, but they each were fitted from the past for the moment they came on. I mean, think about Abraham Lincoln. You needed somebody with patience, with perseverance. You needed somebody who was able to surround himself with people who were better known than he, because he had a deep confidence even as he had humility. And you needed somebody with that gift for language that he was born with, that allowed him to give the meaning of the struggle to the people during that time. Teddy Roosevelt's fiery, combative style was perfectly suited for bringing the big trusts down and regulating the corporations and providing the words that really allowed people to feel that there was some fairness involved in what he was doing, the square deal for the rich and the poor. He had these wonderful sayings, you know, speak softly and carry a big stick, you know, don't hit until you have to and then hit hard. He even gave Maxwell House the slogan, good to the very last drop. So he was the right person for that right time. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt was the right person to deal with the paralysis of the country when he had come through his own paralysis, experimenting with all different kinds of ways to help him walk again. And thus he comes into the presidency experimenting and can really identify with people for whom, as I say, fate had dealt them an unkind hand so that he could connect to them in ways that I'm not sure all of these other ones could have done. And who better for the civil rights struggle than a Southerner like Lyndon Johnson, who had come to the feeling that civil rights was the major issue and that maybe he had a chance because he understood how to make Congress work, that he could deal with the Congress, and boy could he deal with the Congress. If we only had that character back today, bipartisanship would be a rule, not the exception that it is right now. He would call the congressmen at 6 in the morning, he'd call them at noon, he'd call them at midnight, he even called senators at 2 a.m. You know, I hope I didn't wake you up. Oh no, I was just looking here, looking at the ceiling, hoping my president would call. And then he had them over to the White House. If the congressman wasn't there, he'd talk to the wife. If the wife wasn't there, he'd talk to the kid. Now, you tell your daddy he's got to go along with me on this bill. But then he knew he could never get it through. He knew the Congress, so he was perfectly suited unless he got Republicans to join to break the Democratic filibuster from the South. So he knew that Everett Dirksen, man of Illinois, was the man he had to get. So when you see these tapes, or you read these tapes, or hear them that are in the library there, they're fabulous, his conversations with Everett Dirksen. He promises him everything under the sun. You want a postmastership in Peoria? Done. You want me to speak in Springfield? I'll be there. You want an ambassadorship to XYZ? You have it. And they have drinks, and they're trading everything. But most importantly, he knows that Everett Dirksen, unlike, again, the cult of celebrity, wants to be remembered too. So he says to him, Everett, if you come with me on this bill and you bring some Republicans to help break the Democratic filibuster, 200 years from now, school children will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. Two men of Illinois.
And I'm just curious, did you ever get a 2 a.m. phone call from the president, LBJ?
I actually did. I mean, he would call at any time of the day. It was the most extraordinary experience. I started as a 24-year-old White House fellow working for him in the White House, and then accompanied him to his ranch to help him on his memoirs, the last years of his life. And I think it was only later that I realized what a privilege it was to have spent so many hours with this aging lion of a man. He was so sad in those last years, but I luckily was working on the 2 chapters of his memoirs. We were all split up on them. Mine was Congress and civil rights, so he wanted to talk to me, and I never fully understood why he was spending so much time with me. I like to believe it was because I was a good listener. He was a great storyteller, fabulous, colorful stories. There was a problem with them. I later discovered that half of them weren't true, but they were great nonetheless. But I also worried that part of it was that I was then a young woman, and he had somewhat of a minor league womanizing reputation, so I was constantly chattering to him about steady boyfriends, even when I had no boyfriends at all. Everything was working perfectly until one day he said he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded ominous when he took me nearby to the lake, conveniently called Lake Lyndon Johnson, wine and cheese and a red check tablecloth, all the romantic trappings. And he started out, Doris, more than any other woman I have ever known, and my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. It was pretty embarrassing, given what was going on in my mind. But anyway, I now realize what a privilege it was to have spent so many hours with him, and I'd like to believe that's what made me want to make the people come alive, not through knowing them as I knew LBJ, but through diaries and letters and memoirs and research and spending years and years so that hopefully people could feel they were alive, just like I did as I was living with them.
Well, you mentioned earlier about qualities of leadership, so we'll go through a few. Talk about humility and these 4 men.
You know, I mean, I think, again, what humility means, it's not so much humbleness, it's just that ability to acknowledge errors and learn from your mistakes. I mean, when Lincoln was up the first night after the Battle of Bull Run had failed, he could not sleep. And he stayed up all night writing a memo, just figuring out what had gone wrong. The 3-month term of service was too short. The men were not disciplined. There was the wrong general. As long as he could figure out what was gone wrong over and over again, he took responsibility for failure. He shouldered it even for the cabinet members. And he learned. Even in that first handbill, he said, if my opinions are wrong, I will adjust them. So that's the kind of humility, I think, that allows you to grow in office. And he grew continually every day. There's a saying that I'm not sure he really said it, but one of those Abraham Lincoln sayings, I'd like to believe I'm smarter today than I was yesterday as a result of learning from my mistakes.
And what about empathy?
I think empathy is probably the most important quality in a leader. The ability to really be able to see what other people are doing, to feel what they are feeling, so that you can bring them together. I mean, one of the things that Teddy Roosevelt was able to do when he first got into the presidency, he realized, he said, that the rock of democracy was going to founder because people in other parts of the country felt that they were other. The other, it's so much what we're feeling today rather than common American citizens. So he took these train trips around the country where he preached to everybody, whether it was rural or city people, whether it was working men or capitalists, that they were American citizens and they had duties as American citizens. And that was because he felt that things had to change for the people who were not benefiting from the wealth of the country. The gap between the rich and the poor had just begun in the Gilded Age, the same gap that we're suffering from today. And I think that's what allowed him, similarly for FDR, when he would give those fireside chats, he was able to talk directly to people because he could feel them. He would imagine as he was writing the fireside chats that he was talking to a girl standing behind a counter, or a mason, or a construction worker. You know, and that's when they said, people said when he was walking, actually Saul Bellow said he was walking down the street on a hot Chicago night when one of Roosevelt's fireside chats was on the air, and he would keep walking. He could watch people in their living rooms and kitchens listening to the radio, and then he'd hear Roosevelt's voice coming out. He could keep walking and not miss a word of what he was saying. And then he said there was a story of a construction worker coming home one night, and his partner said, "Where are you going?" He said, "Well, my president, he's coming to speak to me in my living room. It's important that I be there to greet him when he comes." So it was that sense of being able to feel what those people might imagine sitting there that created the bond that he felt with the people. And when he died, they said that people were holding one another in their villages and saying, "We've lost our friend, we've lost our friend." How weird it is, somebody said, that one person's died and now 130 million people feel lonely. It's that trust in the person's word, it's that sense that they feel a bond with you that I think is a remarkable thing, and it comes from empathy in the first place.
And one of the important things, I mean, these were, the presidency has tremendous stress in it on any normal presidency, but these presidents had an enormous amount. What about replenishing energy? You know, what were some of their forms of, you know, getting out of their office and doing things to replenish their soul?
It's a really important, I think it's too unheralded as a leadership trait, and it's true, I think, even today. So many of us feel we don't have time to think, we don't have time to relax and replenish energies. The iPhones go with us everywhere, email goes with us everywhere. But these guys were pretty busy, probably busier than us, with the Civil War, the Depression, World War II, and yet all of them, except for Lyndon, he's sort of an outlier, which I'll get to, they found time to think and relax. I mean, Lincoln went to the theater more than 100 times during the war. He said when the lights went down and a Shakespeare play came on for a few precious hours, he could imagine himself back at the War of the Roses in Prince Hal's time. And then he said, "People think my theater going strange, but if I didn't have it, the anxiety would kill me." And then, of course, as I know many of you know, his greatest form of relaxation was his sense of humor and his extraordinary gift for storytelling, a gift that he developed when he was on the circuit here in Illinois, going from one county courthouse to the other. And it was said that when people knew that Lincoln was in town at the taverns at night, they'd come from miles around to listen to him tell stories. And he really had honed that skill, so he could stand with his back against the fire and tell a story that might sometimes have an Aesop's fable moral, but might sometimes be hilarious. I was so glad that I was able to convince Steven Spielberg and Daniel Day-Lewis to tell my favorite Lincoln story, which had to do with the fact, and Daniel did it great in the movie, it had to do with the Revolutionary War hero, Ethan Allen, as you may remember, who went to England after the war, and they decided to embarrass him by putting a huge picture of General George Washington in the outhouse connected to the dinner party. They figured he'd be very irritated at the idea that George Washington was in an undignified place like an outhouse, but he came out not upset at all. So they said, "Well, didn't you see him there?" "Oh, yes," he said, "I think it was the perfectly appropriate place for him." "What do you mean?" they said. "Well," he said, "there's nothing to make an Englishman shit faster than the sight of General George Washington." So, and as you know, Lincoln had hundreds of these stories. So he could tell them at a cabinet meeting, and suddenly you would have to relax. He said a good story was better for him than a drop of whiskey. It was a way of whistling off sadness. So that was his way. Teddy Roosevelt actually spent 2 hours every afternoon exercising. Because he'd had asthma as a child, he needed to exercise his body early on to make his body, and it stayed with him for the rest of the time. It could be a boxing match, a wrestling match, or his favorite form of relaxation was to take a hike in the wooded cliffs of Rock Creek Park. And he made a rule that you had to move point to point, whoever was with him. You couldn't go around any obstacle. So if you came to a rock, you had to climb it. You came to a precipice, you had to go down. So there's these terrible stories of people falling by the wayside as they're scrambling after him over rocks and down cliffs. But the best story was told by the French ambassador. He came so excited in his silk outfit as if they'd be walking on the Champs-Élysées, and he found himself in the woods running after him, and he couldn't stand it. And they finally came to a stream, and he thought, "Thank God it's over." Then he said, judge of my horror, when I saw the president unbutton his clothes and heard him say, well, it's an obstacle, we can't go around it, so no sense in getting our clothes wet. So I, too, for the honor of France, removed my apparel. However, I kept on my lavender kid gloves. Should we meet ladies on the other side, it would be most embarrassing. So I just kept picturing this naked guy with nothing on but his lavender kid gloves. But then Franklin Roosevelt, probably the best of all, had a cocktail party every night in the White House during World War II, where the rule was you couldn't talk about the war. You could talk about books, you could gossip, any movies you'd seen, as long as the war didn't come up. So he, for a few hours, just like Lincoln, could imagine that the war was not there. And after a while, this cocktail hour mattered so much to him, he wanted the people who would be at it, his closest colleagues and friends, to be living in the White House on the second floor to be ready for the cocktail hour. So the White House became the most exclusive residential hotel you could possibly imagine. His foreign policy advisor, Harry Hopkins, came for dinner one night, slept over, never left until the war came to an end. Secretary Missy Lehand lived with the family in the White House. A princess from Norway in exile in America during the war lived with the family on the weekends. Lorena Hickok, a friend of Eleanor's, had a bedroom next to Eleanor. And the great Winston Churchill came and spent weeks at a time in a bedroom diagonally across from Roosevelt's. So when I was finishing the Roosevelt book, I was obsessed with the thought of what incredible conversations they must have all had in their robes at night as they gathered on the corridor that surrounds those 6-bedroom suites up there on the second floor of the White House, and wishing that when I've been up there with LBJ, I thought of asking, where did Roosevelt sleep? Where was Eleanor? Where was Harry Hopkins? But of course I wasn't thinking in those terms when I was 24 years old. So I mentioned this on a radio program in Washington, and it happened that Hillary Clinton, then in the White House, was listening. So she promptly called me up at the radio station, invited me to sleep overnight in the White House. She said we could then wander the corridor together during the sleepover and figure out where everyone had slept 50 years earlier. So 2 weeks later, she followed up with an invitation to a state dinner, after which between midnight and 2 a.m., the President, Mrs. Clinton, my husband, and I, with my map in hand, went through every room up there and figured out, yes, Chelsea Clinton is sleeping where Harry Hopkins was, the Clintons were sleeping where FDR was, and we were sleeping in Winston Churchill's bedroom, which meant there was no way I could sleep. I was certain he was sitting in the corner drinking his brandy and smoking his ever-present cigar. In fact, that bedroom is my favorite story in World War II, which does involve another naked man. What happened is when Churchill was there, he and Roosevelt, right after Pearl Harbor, were set to sign a document that put the Associated Nations against the Axis powers. But no one really liked the word Associated Nations. So early that morning, Roosevelt awakened with a whole new idea of calling them the United Nations against the Axis powers. He was so excited, he had himself wheeled into Churchill's bedroom, our same bedroom, to tell him the news. But it so happened Churchill was just coming out of the tub and had nothing on. So Roosevelt said, I'm sorry, I'll come back in a few moments. But Churchill, amazingly, standing up straight, still dripping from the tub, has, in a very formal voice, said, oh no, please stay. The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States. It's incredible, right? So then Roosevelt tells him the idea. He then has the further presence of mind to quote an entire poem in British literature where the words United Nations had once been used. So the next morning I couldn't wait to go in the bathtub, and then I truly felt I am in the presence of the greatness of the past. But old Lyndon Johnson, but sadly, Johnson could not relax. I mean, that was something. He didn't want to go into the movies because it would be dark and he couldn't talk. You know, when he'd be at a dance, he would be dancing with the wives of the congressmen to be able to get something done. And when he had a swimming pool, which I used to swim with him, presumably at his ranch, but it was so filled with floating rafts that had floating memo pads and floating telephones on them that you could hardly move. And I'm afraid that undid his energy, which was vaunted at the beginning, but you need that time to get away. Franklin Roosevelt was on a fishing trip for 10 days when he came up with the whole Lend-Lease idea. It just came out of his brain from the relaxation of being out of Washington, where they couldn't figure out what to do to help England.
How does the ability to listen to a diversity of opinions inform leadership?
Oh, it's huge, obviously. The ability to have the confidence, as Lincoln had, to create a team of rivals, of these people who were better known, better experienced than he. But then by listening to their different factional understandings, from conservative to radical to moderate, from different parts of the country, he was able eventually to draw them together behind the Emancipation Proclamation. Even though several of them were against it when he first announced it to them, by the time it came out, they were willing to keep their private reservations private because they had become a team, even though it was a team of rivals. And all of my guys were able to do that to a certain extent. I mean, LBJ kept the Kennedy people on, even though he knew that many of them were probably not as respectful of him as they were of JFK, because he needed them at the beginning. And Teddy Roosevelt surrounded himself with lots of strong-minded people. And Franklin had the best of all. He had what he called the most welcome thorn in his side every day of every minute, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, always willing to argue with him, always willing to question his assumptions. Without her, he knew that he had a moral sense coming from her, while he could be the politician. I mean, she was so extraordinary during World War II. She sent so many memos to General Marshall about discrimination in the Army that he had to assign a separate general whose only task was to deal with Eleanor Roosevelt's memos. She was the first First Lady who had a weekly press conference where she made a simple rule: only female reporters could come to her press conference. So all over the country, stuffy publishers are hiring their first female reporter. Entire generation of females got their job because of Eleanor Roosevelt's press conferences. And she also was able to fight for bringing women into the factories. Even in 1940 and 41, before Pearl Harbor, she was arguing that women should come in the factories, but the factory owners decided it's impossible. We can't have a social revolution in the middle of mobilizing for war. Productivity will go down because the men will be looking at them on the assembly lines. They'll never be able to figure out how to operate these machines. It's impossible. But of course, by 42 and 43, with so many men in the armed forces, they had to open their doors to Rosie the Riveter, and the women performed magnificently. In fact, productivity went up rather than down when women formed 60% of the workforce in the shipyards and the airplane factories. So these same old stuffy factory owners decided we better do a study and figure out how these women learned to operate these complex machines so well and so quickly. I love the answer that came back on one of the study forms. They said it was very simple. When a woman, unlike a man, was asked to operate a new piece of machinery, she would ask directions. I think any of us who used to drive with you guys in the days before GPS, when the window would never be opened, but she was there to travel the country 200 days a year to bring him back stories of people, which programs in the New Deal weren't working, which ones were working, and he would listen to her. And I think listening to people who have a different opinion and can question you is part of growing through office, even in the presidency.
How did they control their negative impulses? You know, vindictiveness, you've mentioned in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really extraordinary thing that they figured out techniques for controlling the resentments they might have felt or the anger they were feeling towards somebody. Lincoln famously, of course, wrote hot letters to people where he would then get all of his emotions out in the letter, put the letter aside psychologically, and then never need to send it. They weren't even seen until the 20th century, when underneath would be his notation, never sent and never signed. There was a story I hadn't learned the first time around about Stanton coming into his office, his second war secretary, and there again is Lincoln's extraordinary ability. Stanton had humiliated them when they were young lawyers. Stanton and he had had a case together, and once he saw Lincoln, who might supposedly be the partner on the case, he had a stain on his shirt, his hair was disheveled, his trousers too short for his long legs. He turned to his partner and said, "We have to lose this long-armed ape. He will hurt our case." They turned their back on him. They never opened the brief he had prepared. Lincoln was humiliated, but extraordinarily, instead of leaving Cincinnati where the case was being held, he stayed to watch Stanton work that week, and he saw how brilliant he was. And then later, when his first Secretary of War has to resign, they come to him and say, "This is the man to be your Secretary of War. He's blunt, he's tough, he can be difficult." And Lincoln's able to put that last resentment behind and make him a Secretary of War. But Stanton had a problem with anger management too. When he came in one time, he was so mad at some general, and so Lincoln said to him, "Well, why don't you write a letter to him?" And Stanton said, "Well, that's a good idea, but bring it back to me first," Lincoln said. So Stanton comes in 2 days later, this blistering letter, and he reads it out loud to Lincoln, and so Lincoln says, "Well, now what are you going to do with that?" He said, "Well, I think I'm going to send it to him, of course." "No, you're not. You're going to crumble it up and put it in the wastebasket." And he said, "What?" "Yes, you are." And he did. And he said, "You'll feel better. You'll see. You'll feel better." And again, when I was talking to President Obama, we were talking about that tendency of people like Lincoln to write these hot letters and to file them away. I said, "Do you ever do that?" He said, "What do you mean? I do it all the time." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I write letters every day to the people I'm mad about, and I crumble them up and I put them in the wastebasket." So that's how he handled it. FDR had a different way of handling his anger. When he was angry, say, at an isolationist congressman, his drafts for his fireside chats would go through 5 or 6 drafts, and then they'd read them aloud to the assembled speechwriters. He'd read them, and then they'd go to the next draft. So a young speechwriter came in and heard the first draft of one of his fireside chats where he was calling a congressman who was an isolationist a traitor to the country. He named him. He said terrible things about him. And the young speechwriter said, I can't believe he's going to do this. And the older speechwriter said, don't wait. Well, don't worry about it. Wait till the second draft. His name was gone. Wait till the third draft. The person was no longer a traitor. Wait till the fourth draft. Everything was sweetness and light, but he'd got it out of his system. So I think that's such an important way because there's a dignity to the presidency, and I fear that today in our instant communication world and these instant tweets that anger comes right out. And Lincoln never hardly spoke extemporaneously. I think he could give a lesson to President Trump right now that it's important to prepare your words because words matter. Words matter. They can inspire. They can hurt. They can take us down toxic paths. And he, even though he could have, obviously, he was the best at in spontaneous comments. In those debates with Stephen Douglas, you know, somebody yells at him, Lincoln, you're two-faced. If I had 2 faces, do you think I'd be wearing this face? I have told Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart that if Lincoln were alive today, he could absolutely match them one-on-one. And he could, but he knew that as president, he couldn't do that. So even when the troops had a battle that had been successful and people came to serenade him at the White House, he would simply thank the troops, sing the songs with the people, and wait for his prepared speeches, knowing that the president has the most important quality of all is to be able to talk to the people in words that are going to mean something to them, push them in the right direction, and mobilize their spirit and not their anger.
So we're running out of time. We're running out of time, but I'll ask one more question, and I have a few questions here from the audience. There are a lot of lessons in the book. Is there one in particular that you hope your readers will take away?
Yeah, I think the most important lesson is that leadership is a two-way street. You know, while it's true that these leaders were extraordinary people and they were fit for the time, if there hadn't been citizen movements, they couldn't have done what they did. When Lincoln was called a liberator, he said, no, don't call me that. It was the anti-slavery people and the Union soldiers that did it all. There always has to be that movement from the society that allows the leader to channel that movement, and that's what a democracy is about. Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt could not have done what they did without the progressive movement that started before them. As the industrial order was hurting so many people, child labor was there, and people had no chance to really move in their working conditions and making them better because unions were just being formed. Settlement houses were formed. There was a social gospel in the church movement to help the situations in the cities and the slums, and that was there as a foundation that when Teddy Roosevelt came in, he could mobilize that citizen sentiment to push at the people in Congress who were not willing to start moving and helping the industrial order soften its ways. And obviously without the civil rights movement, Lyndon Johnson could not have done what he did. In fact, the most extraordinary moment really about his presidency is when he gives the famous "We Shall Overcome" speech, which is calling for voting rights after the Selma demonstrations. And he takes up the anthem of the civil rights movement at a certain point, showing that he's the inside person, but it's the outside people that are pushing him in. And the great thing about that speech, which I'm proud to say that my husband worked on, my husband did all of his great civil rights speeches, his great society speeches, and he will be remembered for that too. My husband died this last spring, but his words too will live on in these people who had the conviction, and my husband had the gift for language to make those come together. But that speech, the "We Shall Overcome" speech, is that perfect example of the citizen movement and the president coming together. It starts every now and then. History and fate meet at a certain time in a certain place. So it was at Lexington and Concord, so it was at Appomattox, so it was in Selma, Alabama. And then listen to these words which have such meaning for us today. There is no Southern problem, there is no Northern problem, there is no white problem, there is no Negro problem, there is only an American problem. There is no constitutional issue, this is a matter of right and wrong, and it's wrong to deny Negroes the right to vote. And then incredibly what he does is he said, we have a long way to go, but we shall overcome. But then he goes back to that remembrance of that spirit of Catula, that small Mexican school I talked to you about. He said, my husband had only that day to write the speech because Johnson decided on a Sunday night that he was going to give it on the Monday night. My husband had worked for John Kennedy, he'd worked for LBJ, but this was the most important moment probably in his speechwriting career. So Johnson knew not to bother him because he was in his office writing all day, this 6 hours to write this important speech, but he called him up once and he said, I'd like to talk about my experience at Catula. And Dick knew what that was because they talked about it. So he says in there, you know, he talked about how he saw prejudice on these kids' faces in 1928, and he never thought then that he would have the power that he had then to do something that would help their children and their children's children. So he said, I'm going to let you in a secret. I have that power now, and I mean to use it. And then 6 weeks later, the Voting Rights Act passed. So those are the moments where we have the women's movement, the environmental movement, the gay rights movement. If we're feeling unmoored right now, and if we're feeling that we don't know what to do because this is a normal situation that's become abnormal, we have the responsibility. We have the responsibility to vote. We have the responsibility to be active. There are things we can do. Franklin Roosevelt said, man makes problems, man can solve problems. There are ways out of our system right now. We can get congressional districts by nonpartisan commissions instead of the gerrymandering, which is making people go left and right. We can get money out of the system if we undo the Citizens United, and we have a constitutional amendment that says that they can overturn that decision. My own personal desire is to have a national service program, just because the military is what allows us to be feeling citizens with a common purpose beyond all these separations we have right now from regions and parties and states, and allow kids to go from one part of the country to another, maybe, and serve in the teacher corps, serve in disaster relief, so that they can feel they're not the other. There are answers to our problems, and if there's any lesson I think that comes from the book, it's citizens. It's up to us right now to heal the divisions in our country. It's as polarizing as it's been since the 1850s, and we have to assume and hope that it's going to end in a very different way, and I believe it will.
Well, you just answered one of the questions from the audience. Your prescient. Another question is it easier or more difficult to write about a president that you actually worked with? And in the arc of history, the three other presidents had passed a long time prior, so do they get immortal status quicker, and so is it tougher on LBJ because people that knew him are still alive to say, wait a minute, he did this, he did that?
I think it is harder to write about the person when they're somebody that you knew. And also, I didn't have access when I was writing about Lyndon Johnson the first time to letters or to people's memoirs, because it was so soon after I knew him. And you also don't have the same perspective. In fact, there's a new edition of LBJ and the American Dream that's going to come out next spring, and I'm just in the process now of writing a new foreword for it. And I realize now that I was still so hurt, and so was the whole country hurt by the war in Vietnam, that it was a huge shadow over the book that I wrote then. And even though I did give him credit for the domestic stuff, which I think was terrific, now 50 years later, you realize how much the domestic achievements are part of our everyday life. Think about it, 3 great civil rights laws, voting rights, desegregation, fair housing, Medicare, Medicaid, immigration reform, Head Start, NPR, PBS. I mean, it's extraordinary what he did. And I feel much more with the distance of time that I can understand that than I could then. The other thing I think about the other 3 people is that what I love most as an historian is reading the letters that they wrote. And they don't write letters the same way in these days today. Just to be able to look over the shoulder of somebody in a handwritten letter, like Seward writing to his wife because they were separated during the Civil War, talking about the moon that they share, but also talking about whatever happened that day, and the diaries that they kept that night. You're reading the diaries again. You feel through that written testimony that you're getting an intimate sense of the way they felt and thought, even if you never saw them. Although, God, I would love to have seen them just once. Yeah. But anyway, I do think it's different, and in some ways it's easier after the fact, because you've got the perspective before you even start, just like you suggest.
All right, well, our last question from the audience is, what's next for you? Any hints on what your next book might be or what you might be, your next project?
Well, I had such a great time working on the movie of Lincoln that I thought for a little while until I figure out who the next person might be. And I'd love to write about a woman, so if I don't know that I can wait long enough for that next woman president who will come at some point. So I may find a woman who has a biography that I just like to write about. But in the meantime, I did Tarbell, one of the characters in Bully Pulpit. I'm working on a possibility of a movie with Amazon for her. She's an extraordinary person who, in many ways, exemplified that muckraker tone in the turn of the 20th century, where the press were so investigative reporters that they exposed the corruptions in the society, and she exposed the lack of fair play as Standard Oil became a monopoly, which eventually ended in the Supreme Court decision breaking up Standard Oil. So that's one possibility. I also got involved in the movie about LBJ as a consultant all the way, where Bryan Cranston played him perfectively. I loved it. So that there's a possibility of a movie about Teddy and Taft, and I'm going to be working on a documentary on George Washington, about which I honestly know very little, but I can't wait to learn for the History Channel. So I think part of it is that there's a camaraderie in a movie. You're working with other people. That's what was so much fun about the Lincoln movie. When you're writing alone. And I always had my husband with me writing in the other part of the house, and we could meet for lunch and meet for dinner and talk about what we'd done. But now I think I just need that sense of some group effort. So I think for a little while, the world of the movies will get to me until I find my subject again. And hopefully, I don't know that there'll ever be another subject like Abraham Lincoln. I really felt, just to end it, that if I could just be more like him, you'd be a better person. I'm sure many of you feel that way too. It's not just that he was a great president, not just that he won the war, ended slavery, and saved the Union. It was his kindness, his sensitivity, his empathy, his willingness to let those past resentments go. I mean, I just had that feeling that he had the normal human emotions of envy and anger and jealousy, but somehow he would say you have to damp them down because they'll fester if you allow them inside. They'll poison you. So every time one of those emotions come, I just think Lincoln saying to me, stop, don't do this. We don't have time. We don't have time for those kind of feelings. And if only that spirit could come across our land today. That's why it's so wonderful to be here with him. There really is nobody like him. There is nobody like him. So the fact that you all help support him, that you keep his memory alive through this museum and this library, I'm so grateful to you, and I feel a part of him, and he will be with me for the rest of my life. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.